months of 1326, in the city of Cologne, an aging Dominican friar climbed the steps of the Archbishop's court to answer for what he had said aloud. He was somewhere past 60. He had spent his life in the order's houses and on its roads, and he had held twice the chair at the University of Paris that was reserved for the most accomplished foreign master of his order, the same chair that Thomas Aquinas had held 2 generations before. He arrived that morning, not as a suspect dragged from obscurity, but as a man of standing, a former provincial who had governed dozens of houses, a preacher whose words were copied down by hand and carried across the Rhineland. And still, he had been summoned. And still a list of propositions drawn from his sermons lay waiting on a table, each one underlined, each one to be defended. The charge, reduced to its essence, was that he had said too plainly what could not be said plainly. He had told congregations of nuns and lay people, in ordinary German, that God is nearer to the soul than the soul is to itself. He had said that there is something in the soul that is uncreated. He had said that a person who is truly detached compels God to enter, the way a vacuum compels the air. These were not the sentences of a cautious man, and they had not been spoken in the guarded Latin of the schools, where a difficult claim could be qualified into safety by a chain of distinctions. They had been spoken to women in convents, and to weavers and merchants in city churches, in the language they used to buy bread, and they had gone out into the world without their footnotes. The irony of the scene was almost complete. The man standing before the inquisitors had spent his entire adult life inside the institution now examining him. He had been formed by it, promoted by it, sent by it to Paris to argue on its behalf against the secular masters, and entrusted by it with the care of its German houses. The order of preachers had made him what he was, and what he was had become, to some eyes, a danger to the order. He was accused of dissolving the distance between the creature and the Creator, of saying, in effect, that the soul at its innermost point is not merely close to God, but of the same ground as God. To the men reading the list, this was the erasure of the line on which the whole moral order rested. To the man answering them, it was simply what he had found when he had looked, patiently and for a very long time, at what remains in a person when everything belonging to that person has been let go. He answered them with a distinction that has outlived the trial. He said that he might err, but that he was not a heretic. For the one has to do with the mind, and the other with the will. It was a fine thing to say, and a true thing. And it did not save him. What it did was mark, with unusual clarity, the place where a certain kind of thinker always stands, willing to be corrected, unwilling to pretend he had not seen what he saw. The road that brought him to that room began about 65 years earlier, in the farmland of Thuringian, in a village near Gotha, in a family about which almost nothing certain is known. He entered the Dominican house at Erfurt young, as boys have promised it, and gave himself to a life measured out in bells and silence, and the slow accumulation of books held in common. He was sent to Cologne, where the shadow of Albert the Great still lay across the classrooms, and then to Paris, where he learned to fight in the peculiar theatre of the disputed question, standing before a hall of hostile intelligences and defending a thesis point by point until it held or broke. He wrote in Latin then, and planned an enormous work that would gather all of theology into a single architecture of propositions and commentaries. He never finished it. Almost no one finishes such a thing. Then the order called him back to Germany and made him an administrator. And for years his life was travel and arbitration, and the endless small management of houses full of difficult people. He was prior at Erfurt, vicar of Thuringia, provincial of Saxony, with more than 40 convents under his care, and later vicar general for Bohemia. He walked and rode enormous distances. He settled quarrels. He inspected accounts. And somewhere inside that crowded practical life, he began to speak in his own language, not the Latin of the schools, but the German of the countryside, to audiences who could not have followed a syllogism and did not need to. He preached to Dominican nuns and to the beguines of Cologne and Strasbourg, women living devout lives outside formal vows, and to whoever else came in from the street. And in speaking to them, he had to invent, almost from nothing, a vocabulary capable of carrying weight that the language had never been asked to carry. Words for soil and foundation and stillness were pressed into service as the names of the deepest things. He was, without particularly intending it, one of the makers of German as a language in which one could think. What he made with that vocabulary is the substance of everything that follows. He taught detachment, and he meant by it something more radical than composure, the emptying of the will of its clinging, until the soul wants nothing, knows nothing, and has nothing of its own. He taught that at the center of a person there is a ground, a place he sometimes called a spark, sometimes a little castle, sometimes a desert into which no image can enter, and that in that ground, God's ground and the soul's ground are one single ground. He taught that the eternal birth the Church remembers each Christmas is not chiefly a past event, but a present one, happening now in this soul, or not happening at all. He taught that God is at home, and it is we who have gone out for a walk. And he taught that the highest life is lived without why, not for reward, not for merit, not in order to become something, but simply out of what one already is, the way a just man acts justly because he is just, and not in order to become so. Taken together, these are the claims of a man who had concluded that God is not found by addition, but by subtraction. Almost everything in the religious life of his century ran the other way. More prayers, more fasts, more pilgrimages, more works laid up like coins against a reckoning. He did not forbid any of it. He simply said that none of it touched the point, because the point was not something one could acquire. It was something one already stood in and could not see, being too busy. The whole labor, in his account, was to stop, to let go, to become empty enough that what was already there had room to appear. This is why the trial was, in a sense, inevitable. A teaching that dissolves the economy of merit will always unsettle the people who keep the accounts. He was condemned, though not quite in the way one might expect, and not quite in time. He appealed over the archbishop's head to the papal court at Avignon, and made the long journey south to plead his case in person. An old man crossing the Alps to defend sentences he had preached to nuns. He died before the judgment came, probably in 1328, and no one recorded where he was buried. The bull that followed in 1329 condemned a list of his propositions, while noting that he had submitted himself and revoked whatever might be found erroneous. So the verdict, in the end, was a strange one. The man cleared, the words condemned, and the words by then had long since escaped. They were already copied into manuscripts, already carried into other convents, already being preached in gentler form by his students, who softened the edges and kept the substance. From there, they went into the anonymous devotional books of the next century, and into Luther's early reading, and into Nicholas of Cusa's library, and much later into the vocabulary of German philosophy, where a word he had used for letting be surfaced again in the 20th century, as though it had merely been sleeping. That is the whole shape of it, and it is worth setting out the phases before entering them slowly. First, the Thuringian countryside and the Dominican formation, the shape of a life given over to study and preaching. Then Paris, the chair, the disputed questions, the vast unfinished Latin work. Then the return to Germany and the years of administration, and the first small book of counsel given to young friars in evening conversation. Then the German sermons and the audiences that called them into being, and the danger that surrounded such speech in those particular years. Then the teachings themselves, taken one at a time, and in the order he built them. Detachment first, then the ground of the soul and the birth of the word within it, then the letting be that follows, and the life lived without why. Then Cologne again, and Avignon, and the bull, and last, the long afterlife, and a return to that morning on the Archbishop's steps to see how it reads once the ground has been named. It is a story about a man who spent his life among books and arguments and finally concluded that the deepest thing in a person is silent, imageless, and cannot be reached by reaching. He said as much, again and again, in the plainest words he could find, to people who had no Latin and no leisure and no expectation of being told such things. That plainness was his gift and his offence, and it is the reason that 700 years later his sentences still arrive with an odd directness, as though the intervening centuries had not quite managed to bury them, and as though the desert he described were still there, unchanged, underneath all the noise. The countryside of Thuringia in the middle of the 13th century was a landscape of small fields and dark woods, of villages clustered around a church tower, of roads that turned to mud in the autumn and froze into ruts by December. It lay in the middle of the German lands, a country of hills rather than mountains, of streams rather than rivers, and it produced grain and timber and wool, and occasionally men who went south to study and did not come back. Somewhere in that country, near the town of Gotha, in a village whose name has been argued over for centuries without ever being settled, a boy was born around the year 1260. The record of his beginning is almost nothing. There is no baptismal register, no chronicle entry, no family document that survives with any certainty. There is a name, Eckhart, and there is a later habit of calling him Eckhart of Hochheim, which may refer to one of two small places. And there is a general agreement among those who have looked hardest that his family was probably of the minor nobility, the sort of household that held a little land and a little standing, and not much else. This poverty of evidence is worth pausing over, because it is characteristic of the man rather than merely accidental to him. Almost nothing personal survives from a life of nearly 70 years. There are no letters describing his moods, no reminiscences of childhood, no confession of the kind that Augustine wrote, and that later readers would come to expect from anyone who spoke about the soul. What survives is the work, and the work is impersonal, in a very particular way. He almost never spoke about himself. When he used the word I in a sermon, it was usually to make a point of logic or to occupy a position for the sake of argument, and not to report an experience. He seems to have believed, and to have believed it early, that the interesting thing about a person is precisely what is not personal in them, and he lived in a way that left very little trace of the rest. What is known is that at some point in his youth, he entered the Dominican house at Erfurt. Erfurt was the largest town in Thuringia, a place of merchants and dyers, and a busy market in wood. And the Dominican convent there was one of the important houses of the German province. He may have been 15. He may have been younger. The order took boys, taught them Latin, and shaped them slowly toward the choir and the classroom. Whatever else that entry meant, it meant the end of one kind of time and the beginning of another. A life inside a religious house in that century was measured not by seasons and harvests, but by bells. There was the rising in the dark for the night office, and the sequence of hours through the day, each with its psalms and the silence between them, and the reading at meals, and the chapter meeting where faults were confessed and business settled. A boy who entered such a house grew up inside a rhythm that repeated so exactly that the days ceased to be distinguishable from one another, and he acquired, without anyone teaching it directly, a relation to routine that most people never acquire at all. The routine was not an interruption of the spiritual life. It was the spiritual life, or at least its flaw, the thing beneath the thing. The order he had joined was young. Dominic had died only 40 years before, and the order of preachers still carried the freshness of a project rather than the weight of an institution. Its founding purpose was blunt and unusual. The older monastic orders had been built around stability, a life lived in one place, work and prayer within walls. The world kept at a distance for the sake of the soul. The Dominicans were built around motion. They were mendicants. They begged rather than farmed. They were meant to move through towns and cities, to preach in the vernacular where necessary, to argue with heretics on their own ground, and to win the argument by knowing more. Study, for them, was not a private luxury or an ornament of piety. It was a form of charity, because what a man understood, he was obliged to hand on, and a preacher who did not understand had nothing to give. The constitutions of the order allowed a friar to be dispensed from almost any observance if study required it, which is a remarkable thing to find written into a rule, and it tells us what the order thought it was for. So the young Eckhart was formed by an institution that regarded truth as something to be carried outward rather than hoarded, and that regarded the classroom and the pulpit as two ends of the same motion. This shaped everything he later did, including the things that got him into trouble. When he stood in a convent church in Cologne 40 years afterward and said something about the ground of the soul that no one had ever said aloud in German before, he was not breaking with his formation. He was obeying it. The order had told him that what he knew was owed to the people in front of him. It had not told him what to do if what he knew turned out to be difficult to say safely. His education followed the ordinary ladder of the order, and then went beyond it. There was grammar and logic first, then the study of philosophy, then theology at one of the order's regional schools, and for the most promising, the Studium Generale. The great German house of studies was at Cologne, and Cologne in those years still held the enormous shadow of Albert the Great. Albert had lived until 1280 and had taught there, and had gathered around himself a school of German Dominicans with a distinct intellectual character, Whether the young Eckhart heard Albert himself is uncertain and probably unlikely, though he may have arrived while the memory was still warm, and the men Albert had trained were still lecturing. What is certain is that he entered a tradition Albert had founded, and that tradition had a particular flavour. The great intellectual event of the century had been the arrival of Aristotle. The whole body of the philosopher's work had come into Latin, much of it through Arabic intermediaries and the commentaries of Avicenna and Averroes, and it had landed on Christian theology with the force of an argument that could not be ignored. Here was a complete account of the natural world, of motion, of the soul, of causation, of the good life, worked out without reference to revelation, and evidently true in large parts of it. The generation of Albert and his most famous pupil, Thomas Aquinas, had spent itself on the labour of reconciliation, showing that reason and faith could not finally contradict one another, because both came from the same source. That labour was the intellectual air the young friar breathed, and he breathed it thoroughly. He knew his Aristotle. He used the technical vocabulary of the schools with complete fluency for the rest of his life, and his Latin writings are unintelligible without it. But the German Dominicans had another current running under the Aristotelian one, and in his case, it ran deeper. Albert had a lasting interest in the writings attributed to Dionysius the Areopagite, the anonymous Syrian author of the late 5th or early 6th century, whose works had circulated for 800 years under the name of a disciple of Paul. Dionysius wrote about God in a way that ran opposite to the ordinary direction of theology, where most speech about God adds attributes, saying that God is good and wise and powerful. Dionysius insisted that every such term, however true, falls short and must finally be denied, and that the highest knowledge of God is a kind of unknowing, arrived at by removing rather than accumulating. Behind Dionysius stood the pagan Neoplatonists, Proclus above all, with their vision of everything flowing out from a single source and returning to it. And behind all of it, for a Latin reader, stood Augustine, who had written that God was more inward to him than his own innermost, and higher than his highest. That sentence of Augustine's, more than any proposition of Aristotle's, is the seed of everything the man from Thuringia would later say. The idea that God is not far off and above, but nearer to the soul than the soul is to itself. The idea that the way to that nearness is by subtraction. The idea that the mind's images and concepts, however necessary, are finally obstacles at the last step, because an image is always an image of something, and God is not a something among others. All of this was available in the tradition he was given. What he did with it was not to invent it, but to take it with a literalness that his predecessors had avoided, to press it further than a prudent man would press it, and eventually to say it out loud in a language that had no protective technical vocabulary to soften the shock. For the moment, though, he was a young friar in a house of study, learning the disputation, memorizing distinctions, holding his place in the choir at 2 a.m, while the psalms went on in the dark. He was being trained in a machinery of argument so refined that it could take almost any question apart into its component objections and put it back together with an answer. He would use that machinery all his life, and he would also, at some point that cannot be dated, begin to suspect its limits. A man can spend 20 years learning to make distinctions, and then spend the rest of his life saying that the deepest thing in a person is where all distinctions fail. There is no contradiction in that, only an order. The failure of distinctions means very little to someone who has never made any. He was noticed. The order did not send ordinary men to Paris, and Paris was where he was going. There, in the noisiest and most competitive theological faculty in Europe, the Thuringian friar would take the chair that Thomas Aquinas had once held and argue in Latin before an audience trained to find the weak joint in any position, and put forward a claim about God and being that even his own colleagues found strange. The road to Paris ran west and south through country he had never seen, and it took weeks. He travelled as Dominicans travelled, on foot where the ground allowed it, with a companion carrying almost nothing, lodging in the houses of the order that were spaced across Europe like stations of a single long corridor. A friar could walk from Erfurt to the Seine and sleep every night among men who kept the same hours and sang the same office in the same Latin. That fact is worth sitting with, because it explains a great deal about the shape of his life. He belonged to an institution that had made the whole of Christendom into one interior, and a man formed inside such an interior does not experience travel as exile. He arrives somewhere new and finds the same bells. Paris, in the last years of the 13th century, was the intellectual capital of the Western world, and the theology faculty was its high ground. Some thousands of students crowded the left bank, most of them young, most of them poor, many of them hungry, in a way that the surviving records mention only in passing because it was ordinary. They rented rooms above shops. They copied texts they could not afford to buy. They quarrelled with the townspeople, and the quarrels sometimes turned into riots, and the riots sometimes turned into the suspension of lectures. The university was not a quiet place. It was loud, competitive, and physically uncomfortable, and it produced, out of that noise, a body of thought of extraordinary precision. He came first as a student in the early 1290s, and he came back around 1302 to hold something rarer, the chair reserved at Paris for a Dominican from outside France, the external master's chair, the seat that Thomas Aquinas himself had occupied a generation before. It was an honour the order did not distribute casually, and it marked him at somewhere near 40 as one of the more considerable minds his province had produced. He would hold it again more than 10 years later, a second tenure that only a handful of men in the history of the university were granted. Whatever else is uncertain about his life, this is not. By the standards of his own world, he was a success of the most conventional kind, promoted through every stage of an examined and jealously guarded career. The work of a master consisted largely in the disputed question, and the disputed question was a peculiar kind of theatre. A topic was announced. A junior would state a position. Objections were raised in order, each one numbered, each one given its strongest possible form, so that the argument against the master's eventual conclusion was made as sharp as the room could make it. Then came the counter-authority. Then the determination, in which the master set out his own answer. And then, one by one, the replies to each objection. It was an art form with a fixed skeleton, and like all such forms it rewarded compression. A master who could not think under public pressure was found out quickly. 4 of his Parisian questions survive, and they are strange documents, dense to the point of difficulty, written in a Latin so compressed that a modern reader has to slow almost to a stop. In the first of them, he put forward a claim that his colleagues found startling then, and that has kept scholars occupied ever since. The question was whether, in God, Being and knowing are the same thing. The received answer, the safe answer, the answer that a careful Dominican was expected to give, was that in God they are identical, since God is perfectly simple and admits of no composition. He conceded the identity and then turned it inside out. It is not, he said, that God knows because he exists. Rather, he exists because he knows. Intellect stands first. Understanding is not something God does in addition to being. Being is what understanding looks like when it is infinite. This is more radical than it may sound at first hearing, and it is worth unfolding slowly, because everything he later preached in German grows out of it. If being is the foundation, then God is the greatest of all things that are, the fullest instance of a category that also contains stones and horses, and the men arguing in that hall. He would then differ from creatures in magnitude, in perfection, in duration, but not quite in kind. If intellect is the foundation, the picture changes. Knowing is not a thing among things. It has no location, no bulk, no color, no edge. It is the openness in which things appear. To say that God is intellect before he is being is to say that God is not an item in the inventory of what exists, but the transparency in which the inventory shows up at all. And a soul, insofar as it knows, is touched by that same transparency, is in some sense of the same order as it, which is precisely the thought that, 25 years later, would be read back to him in Cologne with the objection attached. He did not stay with that formulation. In the great Latin project of his middle years, he moved to the opposite pole and wrote, at the head of everything, the flat proposition that being is God, esse est Deus, 3 words that reverse the emphasis entirely. Commentators have argued for a century about whether he changed his mind or was making the same point twice from opposite directions. The likelier reading is the second. He was a man who habitually stated a thing and then stated its inversion, not out of confusion, but because he did not believe any single formulation could hold what he was after. Being is God, and God is intellect, and neither sentence is the last word. And the fact that they resist being reconciled on paper is itself part of the instruction. That great Latin project was the opus tripartitum, the threefold work, and it was to have been the labor of his life. The plan was magnificent, and in retrospect, impossible. The first part of 1,000 propositions, arranged in 14 treatises, each proposition a compressed axiom from which the rest could be derived. A second part of disputed questions following the same order. A third part of scriptural commentaries, in which every text of the Bible would be expounded according to the propositions already laid down. The whole of theology, in other words, deduced and demonstrated and applied, held together by a single articulated frame. What survives is a general prologue, a prologue to the propositions, a prologue to the expositions, a fragment of the first treatise, and a substantial body of commentary on Genesis, Exodus, Wisdom, Ecclesiasticus, and the Gospel of John. It is a magnificent ruin. Nobody knows whether he abandoned it or whether the remainder was simply lost, though the pattern of his later life suggests abandonment, or at least a slow drifting of attention elsewhere. There is something almost predictable in it. A man who came to believe that the deepest reality in a person is a groundless silence was never going to complete 1,000 proposition architecture. The architecture and the silence were pulling in opposite directions, and the silence won. Still, the commentaries that do survive show him at full strength, and they show a method. He read scripture as though every literal event carried an inward meaning that was its real content. The exodus from Egypt is the soul's departure from multiplicity. The creation in Genesis is not only something that happened once, but something happening continuously, since God does not produce a world and step back from it, but holds it in being at every instant, so that creation is present tense, or it is nothing. The prologue to John, "In the beginning was the Word," becomes an account of what occurs in a human interior. Everything he ever said in German is already in these Latin pages, in a form so technical that only a few hundred men in Europe could have followed it. That is the fact that governs this whole period of his life. The Latin work was addressed to specialists, and it was addressed to them in the specialist's idiom, hedged with the qualifications that a trained reader would supply automatically. When he wrote in Latin that something in the soul is uncreated, his readers knew the tradition he was standing in, knew which distinctions were being assumed, knew how to hear an extreme statement as a deliberate stretching of language, rather than a claim to be taken flatly. The Latin carried its own insulation. A phrase that would later look scandalous sat quietly in the middle of a commentary and troubled nobody, because everybody who read it had been trained in the same room. He was, by any measure, at the summit of his profession. Twice a master at Paris, a preacher of the order, a man with the ear of his superiors, the author of a system that, had he finished it, might have stood beside the great Sommet of the century. Nothing in his position required him to do anything further. He could have written and taught and disputed and died a respected doctor of the church, cited in footnotes, argued over by men who agreed on which questions were worth arguing about. But he kept being sent back to Germany, into houses full of men and women who had no Latin at all, and there he found an audience of a completely different kind. People who did not want a proposition to be demonstrated, but wanted, urgently and personally, to know how a human being could come to God. And he found, in speaking to them, that he had to invent the words as he went. The originality that his careful Latin had contained and controlled was about to be released into a rough, unformed, unprotected vernacular, in front of listeners who would take him at his word. By the middle of the 1490s, he was back in Thuringia, in the house at Erfurt, where he had first put on the habit. And now, he was its prior. The building he had entered as a boy, with nothing to his name, he now had charge of. Its bread, its debts, its sick, its quarrels, its young men. To this was added the office of Vicar of Thuringia, which meant responsibility not for one house, but for a scattering of them, and a duty to travel between them and see that the life was being kept. A little more than a decade later, in the year 1303, the order gave him the province of Saxony, a territory that stretched from the Low Countries across northern Germany to the Baltic and contained something near 50 houses of friars, with convents of nuns attached to many of them. He held that office for some 8 years, and for part of that time, he was also Vicar General for Bohemia, sent to set in order houses that had drifted from the rule. It is worth pausing on how strange this is. The man who would be remembered for saying that the soul must want nothing, know nothing, and have nothing spent the central working years of his life managing property, adjudicating disputes about money, appointing and removing officials, and riding, or more often walking across a province the size of a modern country, in order to inspect the accounts of provincial houses. The Dominicans did not, as a rule, permit their friars to ride unless age or distance required it. The ideal was the preacher on foot, staff in hand, going from town to town. Whatever else the office gave him, it gave him roads. He would have known the weather of northern Germany intimately, the mud of spring, the frozen ruts of January, the long flat stretches between one bell tower and the next. He would have arrived tired at houses where the prior was defensive and the accounts were vague. And he would have had to be in those rooms, not a mystic but an administrator, patient, exact, unimpressed. The visitation was the heart of the work. A provincial came to a house and inquired into everything, whether the silence was kept, whether the friars were studying, whether anyone had private property, whether the buildings were sound, whether the community had fallen into debt to the local burghers, whether there were grievances between brothers that had been allowed to harden. He heard the friars individually. He corrected. He wrote things down. Then he moved on to the next house and did it again. Multiplied across 50 houses in 8 years, this is not the life of a man withdrawn into contemplation. It is the life of a competent official who is trusted because he keeps returning and keeps getting it more or less right. And yet it was out of exactly this stretch of years, at Erfurt, in the ordinary evenings when the young friars gathered around him and asked their questions, that the first of his German writings came, the talks of instruction. The Reden der Unterweisung were not composed as a book. They were conversation taken down afterward, in which the prior answered whatever the novices had put to him. Should a man leave a monastery for a stricter one? What to do when devotion dries up and prayer becomes tasteless? Whether it is better to fast or to eat with the others? How to bear the thought of one's own sins? Whether a man who feels nothing at all in his prayer is worse off than one who weeps easily? These are the perennial questions of the beginner, and they are asked in every generation, in almost the same words. And the answers he gave to them are startling, precisely because they refused the terms of the question. The novices wanted to know what to do. He kept telling them that this was the wrong place to begin. People should not think so much, he said, about what they ought to do. They ought rather to think about what they are. The whole weight of the counsel falls on that reversal. A man may change his food, his sleep, his prayers, his order, his country, and change nothing whatever, because he has taken himself along on every journey. Sanctity does not adhere to the action. It comes from the person acting, and it flows outward into whatever the person happens to be doing. As he put it in one of the most quoted lines of the talks, it is not the works that sanctify us, but we who ought to sanctify the works. A just man doing an ordinary thing does a holy thing. An unquiet man performing a great austerity has only made his unquiet more elaborate. This is, in one sense, a piece of very practical advice to young men who are prone to spiritual ambition, to the boy who wanted a harsher rule, the boy who wanted longer vigils, the boy who was secretly grading himself against his brothers. He told them plainly that the outward pattern was not where the work lay. If a man's inner ground were rightly ordered, he could keep the ordinary life of the house and be entirely with God in it. And if it were not rightly ordered, no amount of severity would supply what was missing. He had, in one image, the counsel that a man ought not to think holiness is founded on doing. One must build it upon being. For works do not sanctify us, but we must sanctify the works. There is something in this that goes further than good sense about novices. It is already the seed of everything he would say later. The counsel is not to add practices, but to change the ground from which practices come. It asks for a movement not outward into more religion, but downward into the will itself, into whatever it is in a person that chooses and clings and wants. And the word he uses for the letting go of that clinging is already, in the talks, the word that would organize his whole later teaching. He tells the novices that in all things a man ought to be released, gelassen, let go, let be, given over. He is not asking them to have fewer possessions. He is asking them to stop possessing. What he offers in place of the anxious inventory of duties is something close to a single instruction, repeated in many forms. Get the self out of the middle. As long as a man is seeking himself in his prayer is about himself. As long as he is looking for the consolation he had last year, he is looking for a feeling and not for God. Let the feeling go too, he says. The drought is not a sign of abandonment, but an occasion for a purer kind of trust. And a man who serves faithfully, when there is no sweetness in it, is nearer than the one who is being carried along by pleasure. To the novice who confessed that he was troubled by the memory of his sins, he gave an answer of remarkable warmth, that a man ought not to lie down under that weight, that the wound honestly acknowledged becomes the very place from which humility grows, and that God is not waiting for the perfect, but for the turned. The counsel about the ground of the will has an odd consequence, and he does not shrink from it. If holiness is a matter of the interior ground, rather than the outward pattern, then no particular way of life is privileged. The friar in choir has no automatic advantage over the woman spinning wool, the merchant weighing cloth, the servant carrying water. All of them stand in the same position with respect to the one thing that matters. This is a democratic thought inside a rigorously hierarchical world, and it is one of the reasons his teaching would travel so far outside the walls it was first spoken within. He was telling a room of young Dominicans that their habit did not do the work for them. It would not be long before he was telling lay people, in the same language, that the absence of a habit did not disqualify them. The talks are not systematic, and that is part of their charm. They double back. They answer a question with a story. They are full of the particular texture of a man speaking rather than writing. There is a sense throughout of the elder in the room being genuinely fond of the young men in front of him, impatient with their scruples, unwilling to indulge their heroics, but tender toward the confusion underneath. He is not building an argument. He is trying to loosen a knot, and he tries several fingers on it. What is remarkable is that these years produced this teaching rather than in spite of them. It would be tidy to say that he wrote about detachment because he longed for a solitude the office denied him. But the evidence does not really support that reading. Nothing in the talks suggests a man who wished he were somewhere else. What they suggest is a man who had discovered, in the middle of a crowded and demanding life, that the interior work was not competing with the exterior one, that a person could be entirely given over in the ground of the will while riding to a visitation, or hearing an accusation, or settling a dispute about a mill. He was learning, in the years of the province of Saxony, exactly the thing he would later say in his sharpest form, that a man who has God truly with him has him in all places, in the street as well as in the church, and that if he does not have him there, he does not have him at all. Still, there is a tension in it, and he seems to have felt it. The counsel is contemplative, and the life was not. He was speaking about a stillness beneath all activity, while spending his days in almost unbroken activity. It is possible that the doctrine was hard-won rather than serene. that he had to find a way for the ground to remain undisturbed because he had no prospect whatever of quiet. Whatever the case, the years of administration came to an end. In 1311, the order asked him to return to Paris and hold the chair a second time, an honor almost never given. And after that, he was sent not back to Saxony, but into the Rhineland, to Strasbourg, and eventually to Cologne, into a landscape of convents and devout communities, where the audience waiting for him would be almost entirely women, almost entirely without Latin, and entirely ready to take him at his word. The Rhineland he entered in the second decade of the 14th century was unlike anything Saxony had been. Along the river and in the towns that had grown rich on its traffic, Strasbourg, Basel, Mainz, Cologne, there had gathered over the previous century an extraordinary density of religious women. Some lived in formal convents under Dominican care, houses of enclosed nuns who had taken vows and who owed their spiritual direction to the friars. Others lived in the looser arrangements that the age called begonages, communities of women who had made no vows at all, who kept their own property or worked with their hands, who could leave and marry if they chose, and who nevertheless dressed simply and prayed at fixed hours and organized their whole existence around God. Cologne alone had scores of such houses. Strasbourg had dozens. Their inhabitants were, for the most part, literate in the sense that mattered least to the university. They could read and write the language they spoke, and they could not read Latin. This was the audience assigned to him. As part of his duties in the Rhineland, he was responsible for the spiritual care of Dominican women's houses, a task the order took seriously, and which many friars found tedious. And beyond that formal charge, he seems to have preached wherever people gathered to hear him, in convent chapels and church naves, and the halls of beguine communities. What he faced, week after week, was a room of women who wanted the highest thing he had, and who could not follow a single sentence of the scholastic apparatus he had spent 30 years mastering. The Parisian questions, the propositions, the careful Latin distinctions between being and knowing, all of it was, in that room, simply noise. He had a choice of two paths. He could simplify, give them moral counsel, exhortations to patience and obedience, and the imitation of the saints, the safe devotional fare that filled most sermons of the century. Or he could try to say the difficult thing itself in a language that had never been asked to carry it. He chose the second, and the choice is the hinge of his whole life. Everything he is remembered for comes from that decision. It is worth pausing on what the decision actually required, because it is easy to say that he preached in German, and hard to grasp what that meant. Latin in his century was not merely a language, it was a machine, refined over 1,000 years, with a technical vocabulary for every distinction a theologian might need. It had words for essence and existence, for substance and accident, for the difference between what a thing is and that a thing is. German had none of this. German was the tongue of the market and the household and the road. It had words for soil, for barns, for weather, for the ordinary human affections. To speak philosophy in it was rather like being handed a set of farm tools and asked to perform surgery, so he made the language do what it had not done. He took ordinary German nouns and pressed them into service as technical terms, and he built abstractions the way a mason builds a wall out of whatever stone lay nearest. He took the common word for a piece of ground, the earth under a building, and made it the name of the deepest place in the soul. He took the ordinary participle of letting go and made it the name of a disposition of the whole self. He coined compounds that had never existed, stacked prefixes onto verbs until they meant something new, and turned adjectives into nouns with a freedom no writer of German had yet permitted himself. Scholars who study the history of the language reckon that a substantial portion of the abstract vocabulary of later German thought, the words that Luther and the mystics and eventually the philosophers of the 18th century would reach for without thinking, passes through his sermons. He was not trying to reform a language. He was trying to be understood by the women in front of him. The reform was a side effect, and the sermons themselves have a quality that no Latin work of his ever achieves. They are urgent, spoken, unbalanced, full of sudden reversals and images that arrive from nowhere. He will begin with a scriptural verse in the customary way, translate it, and then leap somewhere unexpected and stay there. He repeats himself, circles back, restates a thought in 3 ways, as though watching the faces in front of him to see which version lands. He uses paradox constantly, not as decoration, but because the thing he wanted to say sat just beyond what a plain sentence could hold. God, he told them once, is nearer to the soul than the soul is to itself. He said things of that order, week after week, in a room of women who had come in from the cold, and he said them without softening. The women who heard him were not passive recipients. This is the part most easily missed. The Rhineland houses had a serious contemplative culture of their own, older in some respects than the friars' teaching, and the Beguines in particular had produced writers of genuine originality, women who had described the soul's union with God in poetry and vernacular prose, a generation before he arrived. Some of what he preached, he had almost certainly learned from that tradition rather than brought to it. And it is largely because of these women that his German sermons survive at all. He did not write them out for publication. They were taken down by listeners, copied, passed between houses, gathered eventually into collections. The manuscripts that carry his voice into the present were produced in the scriptoria of convents by the very people he had been preaching to. They kept him. Without them, there would be a Latin schoolman named Eckhart of Hochheim, respected and forgotten, and nothing else. But the situation into which he was speaking was more dangerous than it looks from a distance, and he must have known it. The Beguines occupied an uneasy position. They were admired by many. Bishops praised their charity. Townspeople left them bequests, and they were suspected by many others, precisely because they did not fit. They had no vows, no rule, no male superior in the ordinary sense, no clear place in the architecture of the church. Women living devoutly, outside every established category, made the authorities uncomfortable, and discomfort in that century had a way of hardening into accusation. In 1310, in Paris, a Beguine named Marguerite Porret was burned in the Place de Grève for refusing to withdraw a book she had written in French about the soul annihilated in love. She had been examined, condemned, released, and had circulated the book again. She declined to answer her judges at all through the long months of her final imprisonment. Her book taught that a soul wholly given over to divine love passes beyond the need for the works of virtue and beyond even the practices of the church, because it has become one with what those practices exist to reach. The theologians who read it saw the abolition of every safeguard. The execution was public, and it was remembered. 2 years later, the Council of Vienne issued the decrees that gave the anxiety a name. It condemned a set of errors attributed to what it called the sect of the free spirit, the teaching, roughly, that a person can attain such perfection in this life as to be incapable of sin, to owe nothing to fasting or obedience, to stand beyond the reach of law. Whether any organized sect holding those views actually existed is doubtful. Historians have looked hard and found mostly the phantom rather than the thing. But the decrees were real, and they created a template. From then on, any preacher who spoke of the soul's union with God in language that seemed to dissolve the distance between them could be measured against that template and found to fit. He knew all of this. He was in Paris, or near it, in the years when Marguerite Porret's case moved through the courts. His own order had supplied inquisitors for such proceedings. He understood better than almost anyone what the vocabulary of union sounded like to a suspicious ear, and he had every professional reason to be careful. He was not careful. He preached the ground of the soul to communities of unenclosed women in the very decades when unenclosed women speaking of union with God were being watched. He said that the soul had something in it that was uncreated. He said that God and the soul, at their deepest point, met in a place where the difference between them could not be located. He told them that a person who has truly let go acts without asking what the act will earn. Every one of these statements, lifted out of the sermon that carried it and set down flat on a page, reads as precisely the error that Vienne had condemned. He must have understood that. He seems to have decided that the risk of being misheard was smaller than the harm of not speaking at all, that the women in front of him deserved the actual teaching, not a devotional substitute, and that he would take his chances with the flattening. There is something in this that goes beyond intellectual courage. He appears to have genuinely believed that the highest truths were not the property of the schools. The learned had built an elaborate machinery for approaching God and had, in his view, mistaken the machinery for the approach. The unlearned woman in a Beguine house, with no Latin and no training and nothing but the desire, was not further from the ground than the master of Paris. She might be nearer, having less to set down. That conviction runs under all the German sermons like water under stone, and it is what gives them their peculiar directness, the sense that he is not condescending to an inferior audience, but speaking to the only audience capable of hearing him without argument. What he gave them, in the end, was a doctrine that could be lived rather than debated, and the first movement of it was not an ascent, but a subtraction. Before the ground could be spoken of at all, something had to be let go, and he began to describe, with a plainness that unsettled everyone who heard it, exactly what and how much. The treatise stands apart from almost everything else he wrote. It is short. It is arranged like an argument rather than a sermon, and it opens with a claim so immoderate that later readers have sometimes wondered whether it could really be his. He had read, he says, the writings of the pagan masters and the prophets and the whole of the new and old law, and had searched in earnest and with all diligence for the best and highest virtue by which a person might come nearest to God, and he had found nothing better than detachment, not love, not humility, not mercy, which the tradition had placed at the summit because mercy was what God himself was said to be. Detachment, the bare and unglamorous willingness to stand free of everything, was set above them all. and he did not soften the placement. The argument he gives for it is strange, and once grasped, difficult to forget. Love, he says, compels a person toward God. It draws the soul outward and upward toward what it desires. Detachment does the opposite. It compels God toward the soul, and it compels him by a kind of necessity, because emptiness is intolerable to being. The universe, as he understood it, does not permit a vacuum. Wherever there is a nothing, something rushes to fill it. And this is not a figure of speech, but a law written into the structure of things. A soul that has genuinely emptied itself has therefore created a condition that God cannot decline. He puts it with startling boldness. Detachment, he says, forces God to come, not persuades, not invites, not merits. Forces. The word is deliberate, and one can feel in it the pleasure of a trained logician who has found an argument that runs in an unexpected direction. It is easy to hear this as arrogance, a claim to have discovered a lever that moves the divine. He meant almost the reverse. The whole point is that the soul does nothing but get out of the way. All the effort in the ordinary religious life goes into acquiring virtues, acquiring merits, acquiring consolations and experiences, and the reassuring sense of progress. Detachment is the one movement that acquires nothing. It is subtraction all the way down, and its power lies precisely in its powerlessness, in the fact that a soul which has stopped reaching has stopped obstructing. God does not need to be attracted on this account, because God is already everywhere, pressing toward the soul with the whole weight of his nature. What is required is not more pressure from below, but less resistance. He was careful, in the sermons where he returned to this, to keep detachment from collapsing into something colder than he meant. It is not indifference. It is not the numbing of the affections, not the cultivation of a stony heart that has ceased to be moved by the death of a friend or the suffering of a stranger. He speaks elsewhere with real tenderness about the obligation to leave even the highest state of prayer in order to bring soup to someone who is sick, and says plainly that a man in the rapture of St. Paul, if he knew of a sick person needing a bowl of broth, would do better to leave the rapture and serve the need. That is not the counsel of a man who has hardened himself against the world. Detachment, as he uses the word, is the absence of clinging, not the absence of feeling. The detached soul feels everything and grips nothing. Things pass through it as light passes through glass, and the glass is not damaged by what passes. The clinging is what he takes to be the trouble, not the world, not the body, not possessions or affections in themselves, but the small persistent grasp by which the soul makes each thing into a piece of itself, and then cannot let it go without tearing. A man does not suffer from having a house. He suffers from being unable to imagine himself without one. He does not suffer from being praised. He suffers from having arranged his interior life around the expectation of praise. Detachment loosens the grip rather than removing the object. And this is why it can be practiced anywhere, by anyone, without changing a single outward circumstance. The cloister is not more detached than the market. The friar who has renounced property, but still measures himself against his brothers, has renounced very little. There is one formulation he returns to that is bleaker than the rest, and that got him into a great deal of trouble. The truly poor person, he says, poor in the spiritual sense the beatitude intends, is one who wants nothing, knows nothing, and has nothing. Each of the three is more radical than it first appears. To want nothing does not mean to be free of appetite for food or comfort. It means to be free even of the wanting to do God's will, since as long as a person has a will of his own that is bent toward God, that will is still his own and still stands between them. To know nothing does not mean ignorance. It means that the soul is no longer aware of itself as knowing, no longer watching its own progress from a slight distance, no longer keeping the interior ledger. And to have nothing means to have not even a place in oneself where God might work, because a place is still a possession, and a soul that has kept a chamber ready for God has kept, along with the chamber, the proprietor. What remains, when all three are true, is what he wanted to talk about, and the whole difficulty of his preaching is contained in the fact that he had no ordinary word for it. Something remains. He is certain of that, but it is not the person as the person has known himself, not the bundle of memories and preferences and self-descriptions that walks around under a name. Those have been let go along with everything else. What is left is barer and older, and in the phrase he would use again and again in the years ahead, more like a ground than like a self. It would be a mistake to read all this as a program for withdrawal. The most practical passages in the whole body of his German work sit right beside the most extreme ones, and they say something that his hearers must have found enormously freeing. He tells them not to seek God by fleeing the conditions of their lives. A person who has God truly, he says in the talks, has him in all places, in the street and among people, just as much as in the church. And if he possesses God rightly, and no one else, no one can hinder him. The test of the interior life is not whether it survives silence, but whether it survives interruption. He is impatient, genuinely impatient, in a way that comes through the centuries, with people who believe they would be holy if only their circumstances were different, who imagine that another cell, another rule, another confessor, another town would finally permit them to become what they wish to be. Such a person, he says, has not fled himself, and wherever he goes, he arrives with the same self and finds it waiting. This is why he could tell a room full of women who had no vows and no leisure that they were not at a disadvantage. The stable and the church were equally available as places to find God, because the finding did not depend on the place, nor did it depend on the manner of the work. A person could be at prayer, or spinning wool, or walking to a market, and the ground of the action was the same ground, only the surface differed. What mattered was whether the soul was doing the work for the sake of something it hoped to get, or doing it freely, out of what it already was. And here one can begin to see why detachment had to be placed above the other virtues rather than beside them. Love, humility, mercy, each of them can be practiced with an eye on the result. Each can become a possession, a thing the soul has and knows it has, and quietly congratulates itself on having. Detachment is the only one that cannot be held that way, because the moment it is held, it has been lost. It is the solvent that keeps the other virtues from hardening into property. He is not dismissing love. He is insisting that love, which still has a self behind it, calculating, is not yet the love he means. Detachment is what removes the calculator. There is a coolness in the language that has put some readers off. He speaks of the detached heart as being like a mountain standing above a small wind, unmoved, or as a door swinging on its hinge. The door moves. The hinge does not. The images are architectural and impersonal, and they lack the warmth of the devotional literature that surrounded him, the bridal imagery, and the wounded hearts, and the tears. But this was deliberate. he had heard, one imagines, a great deal of religious emotion in his years of preaching and hearing confessions, and had come to suspect that emotion was among the easiest things to mistake for God. Feelings arrive and depart. Consolations are given and withdrawn. A spirituality built on them is built on weather. The mountain above the wind is not an image of coldness. It is an image of something that does not have to be maintained. What he never says, and what his hearers must have wanted him to say, is how it is done. There is no method in the treatise, no sequence of stages, no exercises. This is not an oversight. A method would be one more thing to acquire, one more possession, one more chamber prepared. He can describe the condition. He cannot prescribe a route to it, because every route would be travelled by the very self that has to be let go. All he offers, finally, is the observation that the emptiness, once it is genuine, does not stay empty, that the whole architecture of the argument rests on a place in the soul capable of being that empty in the first place. And that place is what he had been circling all along, somewhere beneath the memory and the will and the busy surface of thought, in a region his hearers had no name for, and neither, quite, did he. There was a silence that could hold what nothing else could hold. He had begun, by then, to speak of it directly. He had begun to speak of it directly, and the word he reached for was the plainest one available to him. In the German of the Rhineland, it meant the bottom of a valley, the floor of a lake, the soil a man stood on when he had dug through everything loose, and come at last to something that did not shift. Grunt, ground. It was a farmer's word, a builder's word, the word for the foundation under a house, and for the reason a thing was so, rather than otherwise. And into that ordinary syllable, he poured the whole weight of what he had spent his life trying to say. That beneath the layers of a human being, beneath the memory, with its hoard of pictures, and the will with its wanting, and the reason with its patient sorting, there lay a place that was not made of any of those things, and could not be reached by them. He gave it several names, because no single name held it. He called it the spark, the little spark of the soul, as though what remained after everything else had been stripped away was something small and bright and stubbornly alive. He called it the little castle, a tower in the soul so simple and so one that not even God, he said in one startling sermon, could look into it insofar as God has the modes and properties of the persons. A phrase that would be copied out and carried to Cologne and read aloud to men who did not find it charming. He called it the citadel, the apex, the head of the soul, and most often, and most consequentially, he called it the ground. The claim he made about that ground is the reason his name travelled, and the reason it nearly did not survive. Something in the soul, he preached, is uncreated and uncreatable. Not merely made in the image of God, not merely capable of receiving God, not merely elevated by grace to a share in the divine life, but uncreated. Something in a human being that never began, because it was never made, because it belongs on the far side of the line that divides everything that came into being from the one who did not. It is worth pausing on how that would have sounded in a Dominican priory in 1325, and on why the men who eventually read it in a stack of extracted propositions reacted as they did. The whole architecture of medieval theology rested on a distinction so basic that it functioned less as a doctrine than as the floor everyone stood on. There is God, and there is everything else. and the gap between them is not a gap of degree. Creatures are contingent. They might not have been. They hold their existence the way a hand holds water, by continual gift. And if the gift were withdrawn for an instant, they would not merely die. They would never have been. To locate inside a creature something uncreated was, on the face of it, to erase the only line that mattered. It was the error the inquisitors had been trained to smell, the error they believed they had already found among certain wandering enthusiasts of the free spirit who claimed to have become God so entirely that sin no longer applied to them. Eckhart, on paper, in extract, without context, sounded exactly like the thing the church had been hunting. He knew this, and he qualified. His qualifications are scattered through the sermons rather than gathered into a defense, but they are consistent enough that a patient reader can assemble them. He was not saying that the human soul is God. He was saying that, at its ground, the soul is not other than God, which is a different proposition and a harder one, and one that the German language let him say more easily than Latin ever would have. His formulation, when he was at his most exact, was that God's ground and the soul's ground are one ground, not two grounds touching, not a bridge between them. One. And in that one place, he preached, God's seeing and the soul's seeing are a single seeing, God's knowing and the soul's knowing a single knowing, so that the eye with which the soul sees God is the same eye with which God sees the soul. Whether that is orthodoxy stated at the very edge of what language permits, or something past the edge, is a question that has occupied readers for 7 centuries and will not be settled here. What can be said is that he was not describing an achievement. The ground was not a state he claimed to have attained or a reward for spiritual labor. It was, in his account, simply the case. True of every soul, the beggars and the archbishops alike. True whether anyone noticed or not. What varied among human beings was not whether they had a ground, but whether they had ever stopped long enough to be present to it. And here the vocabulary itself did a certain amount of work that Latin could not have done. The Latin tradition had its own terms for the summit of the soul, the apex mentis, the scintilla, the abditum mentis of Augustine, the hidden place of the mind. These are words of height and secrecy. They point upward, or inward and away, towards something rarefied. The German grunt points down. It suggests not ascent, but excavation. Not a peak reached by climbing, but a floor arrived at by removal. And that reversal of direction may be the single most important thing Eckhart did to the spiritual language of Europe. After him, and largely because of him, the German mystical tradition speaks of depth, where the Latin had spoken of height. The soul does not rise into God. It sinks past itself into a ground it shares with him. 2 centuries later, the word would still be doing that work in the hands of writers who had never heard his name. And 6 centuries later, a philosopher in the Black Forest would still be building on the syllable. Against this ground, he set the ordinary powers of the soul, and the contrast is the clearest way into what he meant. The schoolmen had inherited from Augustine a threefold description of the interior life: memory, intellect, will. Eckhart used the scheme freely, and then, sermon after sermon, showed why it was insufficient. Memory is a storehouse of images, and every image is a picture of something that is not present. Intellect works by distinction, taking a thing and setting it beside what it is not, and its whole competence lies in that separating. Will reaches toward what it does not have, so that its very structure is the structure of lack. Each of the powers is magnificent, and each of them is a way of being at a distance from what it handles. They are the faculties of a creature negotiating a world of many things. The ground, he insisted, is prior to all three. It is not the highest of the powers, but the still place from which the powers flow out, as streams flow from a source that is not itself a stream. And because it precedes the work of distinguishing, nothing distinguished can enter it. This is why he described it, in one of the phrases that stayed with everyone who heard it, as a desert, a still desert, he preached, into which no distinction ever peered, no image, no likeness, no this and not that, nothing with edges. In the desert of the ground, there is no landmark, because a landmark would be a thing among things, and there are no things there. There is only the simple, silent, unmoving oneness that has no name, because naming is already division. It is a strange consolation to offer to a congregation, and it explains a good deal about why his hearers found him at once irresistible and difficult. Most religious speech works by furnishing the interior, giving the soul figures to love, scenes to enter, a face to address. Eckhart worked in the other direction. He emptied the room. He took away the pictures one after another, including the pictures of God, and told his listeners that what remained when the last of them was gone was not absence, but the only presence that had never been merely a picture. God as an object of thought, he warned in more than one sermon, is still an idol. And so he prayed, in the line that has probably been quoted more than any other line he spoke, to be free of God for the sake of God, meaning free of every conception, every construction, every God-shaped image the mind had assembled and mistaken for the reality. That is a hard sentence to read aloud in a cathedral, and it was duly written down and carried to the Archbishop. But the intention behind it was not destruction. He was describing what he took to be a simple, experiential fact about the geography of a person, that the noise a soul makes is not the soul, that beneath the traffic of thoughts and the weather of feelings, there is something that does not move and does not need to be maintained, and that this quiet floor is not a private possession, but the place where the creature and its source turn out not to be two. He could not say how to get there, any more than he could give a method for detachment, because the ground is not somewhere else. It is not reached. It is uncovered. It is what is left when the searching stops, and the searching, being the work of the powers, is precisely the activity that cannot follow the soul into that desert. Everything a person might do to arrive would be one more thing added, and the ground is arrived at only by subtraction. This was the paradox he lived inside and preached from, week after week, in a language still learning how to hold it. And yet, having emptied the room, he did not leave it empty. Silence, in his account, is never merely silence. The desert is not barren. Something happens in that stripped and imageless place, something he considered the whole point of the stripping. And it was to this that his winter sermons turned with a kind of urgency, the event he described as eternal, and yet insisted was happening now, in this soul, in this hour, or else not at all, in the deep of the German winter, when the light failed by mid-afternoon, and the churches were cold enough that breath hung visible in the air above the congregation. The liturgy turned to the Nativity, and the preacher at Erfurt and Cologne and Strasbourg turned with it, though not, as his listeners might have expected, toward the stable and the star. The feast gave him his opening, and he took it in a direction that must have startled some of the women sitting in the choir stalls. The birth that mattered, he told them, was not the one that had happened once in Bethlehem in the reign of Augustus. That one was true, and he never denied it, but a birth that occurred only long ago, in another country, to other people, was of no more use to a soul than a meal eaten by someone else. The point of the feast was that the birth is eternal, which meant that it was not confined to a date. And if it was not confined to a date, then it was happening now, in this soul, in this hour, or it was not happening at all. He liked to set out 3 births and let the listener feel the ladder descend. There is first the birth within God, the eternal generation of the Word from the Father, without beginning, without succession, the utterance by which the divine speaks itself and holds nothing back. There is second, the birth in time, in Mary, in flesh, the one the Church remembered each December. And there is, third, the birth in the soul, in the ground of a person who is quiet enough to receive it. The 3 are not 3 events, but one event at 3 depths. And it was the third that concerned him almost exclusively, because it was the only one his listeners could do anything about. And even there, as will become clear, doing was not what was required. The scandal, for the men who would later assemble the propositions against him, lay in how little distance he left between the second birth and the third. He would say that the Father begets his Son in the soul in the same way, in the very same manner, that he begets him in eternity, and that the soul in which this occurs is not merely made like the Son, but is drawn into the one birth that has always been taking place. To a careful reader with a suspicious eye, that sentence dissolves the boundary between the creature and its source. And dissolving that boundary was precisely the error the Church had lately been condemning. To Eckhart, it was not a claim about status, but about location. He had already argued that the ground of the soul and the ground of God were one ground. If that was so, then whatever happens in that ground happens on both sides of a distinction that does not exist there. The birth was simply the ground's own activity, seen from the side of the soul. What such a birth required was not preparation in the ordinary sense, not more prayers or harder fasts or longer vigils, but a clearing. He returned to this image constantly, and the practical counsel he gave around it is the most concrete teaching in all his German work. The soul, he said, is like a room. Nothing can be born into a room that is already full, so long as the interior is crowded with images, pictures of things wanted, things feared, things remembered, the endless representation of a world the mind carries about with it in miniature. There is no space for a birth to occur, because every image is a something, and God, in his account, is no something at all. It is not that images are wicked. Most of them are innocent, even useful. They are simply occupying the ground. Beneath the images he found a subtler occupant, and this one he treated with less patience, self-will, the disposition that wants things to be a certain way, that keeps a quiet running commentary on how matters ought to turn out, that even in prayer is bargaining for an outcome. This he considered the true obstruction. A soul may be stripped of possessions and still be full of itself. It may live in a cell, own 2 habits and a wooden bowl, and be entirely crowded with its own preferences. The multiplicity of things, as he called that interior traffic, was not really about the number of things owned, It was about the number of directions the will was pulling in at once. And so the whole labor came down to a single reduction, to want nothing in particular, and thereby to become the one thing that can receive everything. There is a line remembered from him, repeated for 7 centuries, because it does the work of a page in a dozen words. God is at home. It is we who have gone out for a walk. Everything in his doctrine of the birth is packed into that image. Nothing has to be summoned. Nothing has to be persuaded to arrive from a distance. The divine is not elsewhere, waiting to be fetched by the sufficiently strenuous. It is already resident, already speaking its word in the ground, and the entire difficulty is that the soul has wandered out into the streets of its own concerns and stands there, in the noise, complaining of absence. The return is not a journey. It is the ending of an excursion. This reversed a great deal that his listeners had been taught, and it reversed it quietly, without any announcement that a reversal was underway. The devotional common sense of the age ran upward. The soul climbed by penance and merit and sacrament and steady effort toward a God located above it, and each rung earned the next. Eckhart did not attack the ladder. He simply pointed out that the birth does not occur at the top of it. It occurs at the bottom, in the ground, in the place beneath all effort, and effort as such cannot reach there, because effort is an activity of the powers, and the powers stop at the door of the ground like servants who have carried a load as far as the threshold. Whatever a person does in order to arrive is one more addition, and the ground is uncovered only by subtraction. The soul does not climb to God. It consents to be found. From this, a whole ethic followed, and it followed in an order that inverted the usual one. Ordinarily, a person performs good works in order to become good, prays in order to become prayerful, practices virtue in the hope that practice will make a virtuous character. Eckhart turned the sequence around. Works, prayer and virtue do not cause the birth. They proceed from it. A soul in which the word has been born acts well the way a healthy body moves well, without deliberating about each step, because the acting comes out of what the person now is, rather than out of what the person is trying to become. He put it in a form his hearers could carry home. It is not the works that make a man holy, but the man that makes the works holy. The same sentence he had given the young friars at Erfurt years before, in an evening conversation about food and sleep and obedience, now stood at the center of his most exalted teaching. And it meant exactly what it had meant then. Change the ground, and the branches take care of themselves. He was careful as his temperament allowed, to say that this did not license anyone to abandon the ordinary disciplines. He was a Dominican, bound to hours and rules he kept for 40 years, and he never suggested that a person who had glimpsed something in stillness might now dispense with the Mass, or with charity, or with the plain requirement to be decent to whoever was standing nearby. What he denied was that these things were the currency in which a soul purchased its share of God. They were not payment, they were consequence, and also, in their way, practice for consequence, the shape a life takes when it has stopped negotiating. And he insisted, against every expectation of his hearers, that the birth left no trace they could inspect. There would be no vision to report, no sweetness to savor, no interior fireworks by which a person might verify that the thing had occurred. Those experiences he treated as, at best, side effects, and at worst as one more set of images to be cleared away. a subtler crowding of the room by a soul that had become connoisseur of its own consolations. The birth happens in a place too deep for the faculties to observe, which is another way of saying that the one to whom it happens cannot stand outside it to watch. What could be observed over time was a change in the way a person moved through an ordinary day. The loosening of the grip, the slow quieting of the running commentary, the diminishment of the need for things to be otherwise than they are. That, in the end, was what he wanted the winter congregations to take out with them into the dark afternoon. Not a doctrine to be believed about an infant in a manger 700 leagues and 13 centuries away, but an event proposed as present tense and available in the middle of a life full of chores, that in the silent ground beneath the images and the wanting, something eternal was continually being spoken, and the whole of a person's religious labour consisted in getting out of the way of a birth that did not require assistance. He asked for no achievement. He asked for a kind of stillness so complete that it stopped counting as an act at all. And once a soul had been emptied, and something born in it that owed nothing to its efforts, a question arose that he could not leave alone, because it touched every hour of the life that continued afterward. If the works no longer earned anything, what were they for? If the soul had stopped bargaining, what did its ordinary days look like? The rising, the sweeping, the walking to the next town. To that, he gave one of the strangest and most freeing answers in medieval thought, and he found it, of all places, in a rose. There is a line, 3 centuries younger than Eckhart, that has come to stand for everything he meant, and it is worth naming its true author before letting it do its work. The rose blooms because it blooms, wrote the poet Angelus Silesius in the 17th century. It pays no attention to itself, and does not ask whether anyone is looking. Silesius was reading Eckhart, or reading those who had read him, and he compressed into a single image a phrase that the Dominican had used again and again from the pulpit at Cologne and Strasbourg, a small German construction that carries almost the whole weight of his practical teaching, Sunder warumbe, without why, without a wherefore, without the little clause that ordinarily follows every human action, and explains it in order to, so that, because then, Eckhart's own version was not the flower, but life itself. If anyone were to ask life for 1,000 years why it lived, he said, it could give no answer but this: I live because I live. Life lives out of its own ground and wells up out of itself, and therefore it lives without why, because it lives for itself. He said the same of the just man and of God, and, in the boldest of these sermons, of the soul that had let go of everything. Whatever still had a why attached to it was not yet free. Whatever needed a reason outside itself to justify its existing had not yet arrived at its own ground. This was the practical face of detachment, and he gave it a name that would travel farther than almost anything else he coined. Gelassenheit, letting be, releasement, a kind of leaving alone that is not neglect. The word is built from the verb lassen, to let, and it carries in ordinary German the sense of composure, of a person who is unhurried and unrattled. Eckhart deepened it until it meant something closer to a permanent posture of the will. The detached soul, he taught, does not merely abstain from grasping on particular occasions. It has laid down grasping as such. It has let things be what they are, let God be what God is, and let itself be whatever it turns out to be, having stopped supervising the outcome. What made this radical, and what made it dangerous, was the way it dissolved a whole economy of anxiety that structured medieval religious life from top to bottom. That economy ran on merit. A person performed a good work, a fast, an alms, a pilgrimage, a mass said for the dead, and the work was understood to accumulate somewhere, credited to an account that would be settled after death. The system was not cynical. It was, in its own way, a great engine of charity, and it built hospitals and fed the poor and gave the frightened something to do with their fear. But it made the interior life into a ledger, and it turned prayer into a transaction in which the worshipper never quite stopped calculating. Eckhart looked at this and said, with a flatness that must have startled the Beguines listening, that anyone who seeks God for something other than God has not found God at all, and that the man who prays for goods prays for nothing, since he seeks a nothing, and God is not a nothing. To use the eternal as a means to any end whatever was to have missed what the word meant. He pressed it further in the Sermon on the Just Man, which is perhaps the cleanest statement of the whole idea. The just man, he said, is one who acts justly because he is just, not one who acts justly in order to become just. Justice does not arrive as a reward for a sufficient quantity of just behavior. It is a condition of the ground, and once a person is standing in it, the just actions follow the way warmth follows fire, without deliberation and without a bargain. Ask such a man why he acts as he does, and he can give no better answer than the rose gives, or than life gives, because that is what he is. He does not work for wages. He works the way water runs downhill. The consequences for the ordinary religious observances were not what one might expect. Eckhart did not tell people to stop fasting or praying or giving alms. He told them that the works were fine, and that the anxiety attached to them was the trouble, and that a person who had let go could keep every observance without being owned by a single one of them. What he objected to was the reversal by which the practice became the point and the ground was forgotten. He compared such a person to a man who mistakes the road for the destination and settles down to live on it. And he said, in a phrase that got him into a great deal of difficulty later, that as long as a man does his works for the sake of the kingdom of heaven, or for God's sake, or for the sake of his own blessedness, he is simply in error. The authorities heard this and grew uneasy, and it is not difficult to see why. Stripped of its context, the teaching could be made to sound like a license, as though the free soul stood above the rules and could do as it pleased, which is precisely the charge that had been laid against Marguerite Porete and the heretics of the free spirit. The inquisitors of Cologne would eventually collect these very sentences and set them in a list without the sermons that surrounded them. But Eckhart's letting be was not a permission to indulge. It was, if anything, more demanding than the ledger it replaced, because the ledger could be satisfied, and letting be could not. A man can complete a fast. He cannot complete the surrender of his own wanting. That work has no last day, and there is one sermon in which the whole doctrine turns unexpectedly practical, and it is the strangest piece of biblical interpretation he ever produced. The story is the one about the two sisters at Bethany. Martha is busy in the kitchen and complains that Mary is sitting idle at the feet of the guest, and the guest replies that Mary has chosen the better part, which shall not be taken from her. For 1,000 years this passage had been read one way, and only one way. Mary is contemplation, Martha is action, and contemplation is higher. Every monastic writer had leaned on it. It was the charter of the cloistered life. Eckhart read it backwards. Mary, he said, was still a beginner. She sat at the feet of the guest because she needed to sit there, because she was drinking in sweetness and consolation, and could not yet do without them. And there was nothing wrong with that, except that it was not the end of the road. Martha was the mature one. Martha had been long in the school and had learned to move among the pots and the guests and the practical demands of the hour while remaining wholly present in her ground, undisturbed, unabsorbed by the work, and yet doing it well. When she spoke to the guest about her sister, Eckhart suggested she was not complaining out of resentment, but out of a kind of loving concern. She wished Mary to arrive where she herself already stood, in the place where a person can be entirely occupied and entirely still at the same time, and the reply she received, in Eckhart's hearing, was not a rebuke at all, but a reassurance that Mary would get there too. It is an extraordinary inversion, and it explains a great deal about the man who made it. Here was a friar of the order of preachers who had spent decades in the saddle, who had governed provinces and settled disputes and walked between houses in bad weather, who had never had the luxury of an unbroken contemplative morning in his life. The teaching he built made room for exactly that life. He was not describing an escape from the world into a quiet cell. He was describing a way of standing in the world that did not depend on the world's cooperation. If the ground of the soul was silent and uncreated, then it was silent in the kitchen as well as in the choir, and the noise of the kitchen could not reach it. This is why he could say, without contradicting himself, that a person who was truly detached would find God as fully in the stable as in the church, and that if such a man were in an ecstasy and knew of a sick person needing a cup of soup, he would do better to leave the ecstasy and bring the soup. The higher state proves itself by being interruptible, a contemplation that shatters when someone knocks at the door was never the deep thing. What he wanted was not a life divided into sacred hours and ordinary ones, with the ordinary ones endured for the sake of the sacred, but a single undivided life in which the sweeping and the walking and the tending of the sick were themselves the birth continuing to happen, unremarked, without ceremony, without why. So the whole arc of the teaching closes on itself. Detachment empties the soul. The birth fills what has been emptied. And letting be is simply what the emptied and filled soul looks like from the outside. Going about its Tuesday, there is no achievement to display and no ladder to be found standing on. There is only a person doing what is in front of them with a peculiar completeness, because nothing in them is elsewhere, negotiating. But a teaching of this kind, given in German to women without Latin, in cities already nervous about women who claimed inward freedom, could not be preached indefinitely without someone writing the sentences down and carrying them to a man with authority to act. In Cologne, in the last years of the 1320s, that is exactly what happened. The articles were being copied out of the sermons even as he preached them. Cologne in the middle of the 1320s was a city of some 40,000 souls, the largest in the German lands, crowded along the Rhine with its half-built cathedral, standing open to the weather, like a promise no one alive expected to see kept. The Dominican house there was among the most important in Northern Europe, the place where Albert the Great had taught and died, and it was to Cologne that the old master had come to lecture and preach in what everyone assumed would be the honoured close of a long career. He was somewhere past 60. He had held the Paris chair twice, governed a province of some 50 houses, and been sent by his order to whatever difficulty it most needed solved. There were few men in the German church whose record was harder to attack. The Archbishop was Henry of Werniberg, a nobleman by birth and a reformer by temperament, and he had spent years pressing against what he took to be the disorder of religious life along the Rhine. He had moved against beguines, against wandering preachers, against communities that lived devoutly, without living under any rule that a bishop could inspect. He was not a foolish man, and he was not, by the standards of his office, a cruel one. He believed that souls were being lost to a species of teaching that told the unlearned they had God within them and needed nothing further. And he had before him, by 1326, a list of sentences drawn out of sermons preached in his own diocese, which seemed to him to say precisely that. The list had been assembled with care, and this is the detail that gives the whole episode its particular sadness. 2 Dominicans of his own order, men who had heard him preach or read the copies that circulated among the convents, had gone through the German sermons and the Latin commentaries, and pulled out the propositions that could not be defended in their bare form. 49 articles in the first list, another 59 in a second. Some were drawn from works he acknowledged. Some came from writings he said were not his at all. Nearly all of them shared a common feature. They were the sharpest sentence of a passage, lifted out of the reasoning that had prepared it and the qualification that had followed it, and set down alone on the page where it looked, indeed, like something no orthodox master should have said, that the ground of the soul is uncreated, that the just man seeks nothing from God, that God is nearer to the soul than the soul is to itself. Preached, these had been the culmination of an argument. Copied out, they were charges. His response, when the summons came, was not the response of a man frightened into silence. He answered in September of 1326 with a written defence of some length, and its tone is worth attending to, because it is the tone of someone who is genuinely astonished. He objected first to the procedure itself. A master of theology of his standing, he argued, holding a chair and a mandate from his order, was not properly subject to a diocesan inquisition in this manner. The matter belonged to the university, or to the order, or to Avignon, not to an archbishop's commission staffed by his own brothers. He objected second to the method, pointing out that the articles had been taken from their context, and that a sentence meant to shock a congregation into attention could not be weighed as if it were a proposition offered in the schools. And then he made the distinction on which everything afterward would turn. He might err, he said, but he could not be a heretic, since the first belongs to the intellect and the second to the will. He may have been mistaken. He had not been obstinate. He had never wished to hold anything against the faith or against the church. And if anything he had written or preached was found to be wrong, he withdrew it in advance. That formula, offered freely and long before any judgment existed, would prove to be the thing that saved his name, while failing entirely to save his sentences. The commission proceeded through 1326 and into 1327. In February of that year, in the Dominican church at Cologne, he had a public declaration read out to the congregation in Latin and then translated into German, so that the ordinary people who had listened to him could understand it. He detested, he said, everything false in what he had taught, in the past and in the future, and he submitted whatever he had written or said to the judgment of the Church. It was not a recantation of any specific doctrine. It was a submission of the whole body of his work to authority, which is a different act, and he seems to have meant it exactly as he said it. Then he appealed, over the Archbishop's head, to the Pope. So the old man set out for Avignon. It is a long way from the Rhine to the Rhone, some 600 miles, and he was in his late 60s and travelling in the company of the provincial and several of his brothers, who had come to stand with him. The order, it should be said plainly, did not abandon him. The Dominicans defended their master through the whole proceeding, and their general chapter that year issued a rebuke to those friars who blackened the reputations of their own brethren. Whatever the outcome, he did not go south alone or disowned. Avignon then was the seat of the papacy, a river town swollen into a capital, thick with lawyers and petitioners, and the machinery of a court that had made a science of delay. John the 22nd was Pope, a canonist of formidable energy, already locked in bitter quarrels with the emperor and with the Franciscans over poverty, and his court had by that stage acquired a great deal of practice in the examination of suspect propositions. A new commission was appointed. The 100 and more articles were reduced, examined, and cut down again to 28. He answered them. The process ground on through 1328, and somewhere in the course of it, he died. The date is not recorded, and neither is the place, though it was probably early in 1328 and probably at Avignon or on the road. There is no account of his last hours, no deathbed scene, no report of what he said. For a man whose words filled hundreds of pages and reshaped a language, the end is a silence in the record, nor is it known where he was buried. The grave of one of the most influential teachers the German Church ever produced was not marked in any way that survived, and no one afterward could say with certainty where to look for it. There is something almost too fitting in that, and it is best not to press it. But it is difficult not to notice that the man who had preached a desert in the soul, where no image could enter, left no image of himself behind. Not even a stone. The judgment came on the 27th of March, 1329, more than a year after his death, in a bull that begins with the words, "In agro Dominico," in the field of the Lord. The Pope wrote that in the field of the Lord over which he had been set as watchman, he was bound to guard against the enemy who sows tares among the wheat. And then he set out the articles, 28 of them. 15 he declared heretical outright, including the proposition that something in the soul is uncreated and uncreatable, and the sentences that seem to make the world eternal, or to say that the good man wills nothing beyond what God wills, because his will is God's. 11 more he called ill-sounding, rash, and suspect of heresy, though capable of a Catholic sense if they were carefully explained. And 2 further articles he noted as ones the master had denied ever having taught at all. Then, at the end, came the sentence that changed the meaning of the whole document. The Pope recorded that Eckhart, at the close of his life, had professed the Catholic faith and had revoked and deplored the 26 articles he had preached insofar as they could generate in the minds of the faithful a heretical opinion or one erroneous and hostile to true faith, and that he had done so in the presence of a notary and witnesses, submitting himself to the judgment of the Apostolic See. The man, in other words, was not condemned. He had died in communion, having submitted. What was condemned was the language. It is a strange verdict, and its strangeness has occupied readers ever since. The bull was ordered published in the province of Cologne, and only there, which suggests a wish to contain the damage rather than to broadcast it. It named a dead man who could not answer, and articles he had already offered to withdraw. It condemned sentences that, taken in their setting, most of the theologians who examined them would probably have allowed, and it was too late. In the only sense that mattered, because the sermons were already loose in the world. They had been copied by nuns for other nuns, carried between convents along the Rhine and the Danube, bound into collections whose compilers no longer troubled to record whose sermon was whose. Within a generation, the manuscripts were circulating in Bavaria, in Austria, in the Low Countries, sometimes under his name, and sometimes under no name at all, sometimes attributed to safer men. A bull can silence a preacher. It cannot easily unsay a sentence that a woman in Cologne has learned by heart and repeated to her sister in Strasbourg. So the trial ended without ending. The archbishop had his condemnation. The order kept its master's honor. The Pope had drawn his line, and the words went on traveling quietly through the German-speaking lands in the hands of people whom no commission had ever thought to consult. They would surface again in the next generation in the mouths of his own students, softened just enough to pass, and then again and again down the centuries in places he could not have imagined, carrying the same odd insistence that the deepest thing in a person is not the person's own making. The first hands to carry them were hands he had trained. Johannes Tauler, who had heard him preach in Strasbourg, and perhaps in Cologne, spent the decades after the condemnation saying much the same things in a manner no commission could easily fault. He kept the ground and the birth and the emptying, and he set them inside a warmer, more pastoral frame, speaking to burghers and nuns about the trials of ordinary devotion, about dryness and consolation, about the long patience required of anyone who wants what cannot be seized. He spoke of the ground of the soul as a place to which a person must sink rather than climb, and he was careful, in a way his master had not always been, to keep the creature on one side of the line and the Creator on the other. It was the same house, with the load-bearing walls reinforced. Henry Suso went further in the other direction, toward feeling. Where Eckhart had been austere and speculative, Suso wrote of longing, of the soul as a knight in service to eternal wisdom, of tears and images and the sweetness that visits and then withdraws. He also wrote a defense of his teacher, a book in which truth herself appears and settles the disputed questions, explaining what the master had meant and what he had not. It was an act of loyalty, performed at some risk, by a man who had watched the condemnation land and who understood exactly which sentences had caused it. Between the two of them, Tauler and Suso carried the substance forward while allowing the dangerous formulations to soften at the edges. And in doing so, they kept alive a way of speaking that might otherwise have died with the manuscripts. Out of that same milieu, some decades later, came the small anonymous book that would eventually be called the Theologia Germanica. Its author is unknown, a priest of the Teutonic Order in Frankfurt. And the book is little more than a sequence of short chapters on self-will and its surrender, on the difference between what is one's own and what is not. It says almost nothing that Eckhart had not said, and it says it without a single dangerous phrase. That book fell into the hands of a young Augustinian friar in Wittenberg, who was, at the time, in serious trouble with himself. Luther printed it twice, once in part and once whole, and declared in his preface that apart from the Bible and Augustine, he had never met a book from which he had learned more of what God and Christ and man and all things are. He did not know whose thought he was reading. The line ran back to a condemned Dominican, whose name had been quietly detached from the sentences long before they reached him. And the strangeness of that is worth sitting with. The seed of the German Reformation's inwardness had been planted by a man the Church had declared to have taught error. The thread went on, thinning in places, surfacing in others. Nicholas of Cusa, a cardinal and a mathematician, owned a manuscript of the Latin works and annotated it in his own hand. And though he warned that such things should not be put before the untrained, he built his own philosophy of the coincidence of opposites and the learned ignorance on ground that had already been broken. 2 centuries later, a Silesian physician turned poet, writing under the name Angelus Silesius, compressed the whole teaching into rhymed couplets of astonishing compactness. Among them, the line that the rose is without why, blooms because it blooms, cares not for itself, asks not whether it is seen. The image had been Eckhart's, spoken from a pulpit to women who could not read Latin. It became a couplet, and the couplet outlived every commission that had ever met to examine it. Then a long silence, or something like one, while the manuscript sat in monastic libraries, and the name meant little. The recovery came in the 19th century, and it came from philosophers rather than from churchmen. Franz von Baader read the sermons and pressed them on Hegel, who found in them, to his evident delight, a medieval anticipation of his own conviction that the divine comes to itself in human consciousness. Hegel is said to have exclaimed, on hearing a passage read aloud, that here at last was what he had been wanting. Schopenhauer, who agreed with Hegel about almost nothing, took up the same texts from the opposite side and read them as European proof of what the Upanishads had taught, that the individual will is the source of suffering, and its surrender the only release. He set Eckhart beside the Buddha and considered them to be saying one thing in 2 idioms. The Church had condemned the sentences as an over-identification of the soul with God. The philosophers seized on precisely that as the point of interest. The 20th century brought the scholars, and with them a slower, more careful recovery. A critical edition of the Latin and German works was begun in the 1930s and took most of the century to complete, sorting authentic sermons from imitations, restoring readings, setting the daring statements back into the arguments that had produced them. What emerged from that patient labor was not the free-spirited pantheist the inquisitors had feared, nor quite the proto-idealist the philosophers had wanted, but a rigorous scholastic thinker who had chosen to say difficult things in a language not yet equipped for them and had accepted the consequences of the choice. The rehabilitation was never formal. There was no reversal of the bull, no ceremony. But by the end of the century, Dominicans were quoting him without apology. Popes had spoken of him warmly, and the Articles of 1129 had become a historical document rather than a live prohibition. Meanwhile, the word itself had migrated into places he could not have foreseen. Martin Heidegger, looking for a term to name a relation to technology and to being that was neither mastery nor passivity, reached back into the German mystical vocabulary and took Gelassenheit, releasement, letting be, He emptied it of its theology, or tried to, and used it to describe a comportment in which things are neither forced nor fled, a saying of yes and no at once to the machinery of the modern world. Whether the borrowing was faithful is a matter of long argument. What is not in doubt is that a word coined in a Rhineland pulpit for the surrender of self-will to God had become, 600 years later, a technical term in a philosophy that had set God aside. And in the same century, the comparisons ran east. Japanese scholars of Zen found in the sermons a European voice speaking of emptiness, of the mind without images, of the ordinary act performed without calculation, and read them with a shock of recognition. Suzuki wrote that when he first read Eckhart, he thought he was reading a Buddhist text. Students of Vedanta found the ground and the uncreated something, and thought immediately of the self that is not different from the absolute. The parallels can be pressed too hard. Eckhart was a Christian priest who preached the Trinity and the Incarnation, and never once suggested otherwise. And his desert is entered through the Word made flesh, not around it. But the fact that the resemblances are there at all, that a Dominican in Cologne and a monk in Kyoto could arrive at such similar descriptions of what happens when a person stops grasping, suggests that he was describing something rather than inventing it. Which returns the matter to that room in Cologne. In the first months of 1326, and the old man standing before the commission with a list of extracted sentences between them. It looks different now. It was never really a trial about pantheism, whatever the article said. It was a trial about audience. Every one of the propositions that alarmed the inquisitors would have passed without comment in a Latin disputation, hedged with distinctions, qualified into safety, argued before men trained to hear the qualification inside the claim. What made them dangerous was that he had said them in German, in the plain speech of the kitchen and the market, to women in convents and lay people in the nave who had no training in distinguishing the manner of speaking from the thing said. He had taken the highest and most delicate matter in the schools and handed it, unglossed, to people the schools had never intended to teach, and he had done it, by his own account, without why. Not to gain a following, not to found a movement, not to advance in the order he had already served at its highest levels. He preached the ground because the ground was there, and because the people in front of him were hungry, in the same way that the rose blooms. The condemnation was the direct and predictable consequence of that indifference to consequence. A man more careful of what his words might cost him would have written the same thoughts in Latin, and they would have been read by 400 specialists and forgotten. Because he was not careful, they were learned by heart by women whose names are lost and copied and carried and are being spoken still. So the paradox in the opening scene resolves itself quietly. The most honored preacher of his order was condemned precisely for the thing that made him worth remembering. The condemnation was the price of the reach, and the reach is why anything survived at all. What he pointed at is harder to state than any of this, and he said so constantly, which is why he kept changing the words for it. A ground, a spark, a little castle into which nothing can enter, a desert where no image comes, a silence beneath all speech, which is not an absence of sound, but the condition on which sound becomes possible. He spent 30 years finding phrases for it, and told his listeners that every phrase was wrong, that whoever had understood him should now let the understanding go, since the understanding too was an image. And images are precisely what have to fall away. And perhaps that is where the whole long argument comes to rest. Not in a doctrine to be held, since he would have taken the holding away, but in something simpler and much older, which he believed was already there, and had never not been there. The mind reaches all day. It reaches for explanations, for reassurance, for the next thing and the thing after that. And it does not know how to stop reaching, and it grows very tired. He was saying, in as many ways as he could find, that beneath all that reaching there is a still place that was never made by the reaching and cannot be lost by its ceasing, that it does not have to be built or earned or even found, that it is quiet there and always has been, and that when the reaching finally slows and the day releases its hold and the last of the images thin out and go, what remains is not emptiness at all, but the ground, waiting exactly as it was,